At dawn, 150 warriors blocked the only road out of the valley. They didn't shout, they didn't draw. They just waited, staring at the lone cowboy who stood before them, empty-handed. Hours earlier, he'd given his only horse to a dying enemy chief and walked 20 miles through storm and silence. Now, both his town and the tribe want answers. Mercy is a dangerous thing out here. And today, someone's going to pay for it. The question is, will it be him? The desert held its breath. Not a leaf stirred, not a coyote cried. The morning sun was barely a whisper over the horizon, casting pale gold along the ridgelines, but already the heat promised to rise like a punishment. Before we find out why a man would trade his only chance of survival for a dying enemy, what the chief's broken spear truly meant, and how one silent choice nearly lit the fuse of war, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't just tales, they're the weight of choices carved into the land, and the voices history tried to leave behind. Your support helps us keep them from vanishing. One click lets us ride further, dig deeper, and give justice to the forgotten. Thank you. Dust hovered mid-air, undisturbed, as if time itself had stalled to witness what now stood in the valley mouth. A line of warriors 150 strong blocked the only road leading eastward. Their horses were still, disciplined. No one spoke, no one needed to. Spears gleamed faintly in the rising light, feathers twitched in the breeze, and the silence pressed in so tightly, it felt like glass ready to crack. At the center of the scene, a single man stood alone on the bare earth, his boots planted where the dust had not yet settled. He was lean, sun-bitten, wrapped in worn leather and stained canvas. A rifle lay across his back, untouched. His hat was low over his eyes, casting shadow over a face carved by sun and solitude. His horse, a chestnut gelding with a white blaze down its face, was nowhere to be seen. This man, who had walked back across the canyon floor in the dead of night, was not surrounded by his own. No deputies, no posse, no flag or banner. Just him, breath slow, jaw clenched, hands empty. His name would not matter here, only his choice. A crow called once and flew overhead. The wings sliced the silence. Somewhere behind the rows of warriors, the faint clink of a bridle broke the spell, and a rider nudged forward, not enough to charge, only to mark attention. It was the tribal captain, his hair braided tight, eyes like flint. He didn't speak, he only watched. From somewhere unseen, the narrator's voice rose like a ghost carried on wind. He gave up the only thing keeping him alive. No one flinched. The cowboy's fingers didn't twitch toward the rifle. He didn't reach for water. He didn't retreat. The warriors watched him, the way fire watches dry brush. Not with rage but with certainty. This wasn't a standoff, not yet. This was judgment. Behind the cowboy, the trail curled back toward a town still sleeping under roofs of red clay and rusted tin. They didn't know, not yet, that when the sun broke over the ridge, it would find them already surrounded. That this lone man had made a decision hours before that now held every life in the valley in its grip. Why had he done it? Why had a man with no allies, no badge, no need to get involved, given his only horse to a wounded enemy chief? Why had he carried that body across 20 miles of canyon scrub, on foot, under moonlight, to the edge of a settlement that wanted nothing more than to pretend none of this was real? What had he risked to make that ride? And what was he about to lose because of it? The warriors didn't move, neither did he. The sun crested fully now, and the first shadows of the spears fell across the road. The wind kicked up once more. But still, no one spoke. Then, hoofbeats. From behind. Another rider. And just like that, the silence cracked. The rain had come hard the night before, drumming across the mesa like a war chant. It didn't last long, desert storms never did, but it left behind a silence thick with damp earth and the smell of mesquite. The air carried the scent of thunder long after the sky had cleared, and the morning that followed was quieter than it had any right to be. The cowboy rode alone, as he always did. His duster was soaked through at the edges, the leather clinging to his arms like a second skin. His hat was pulled low, brim dripping with the last of the storm. He didn't speak to his horse, didn't whistle a tune, didn't mutter about the weather, just rode slow, steady, eyes scanning the path ahead, like the land might speak if he looked hard enough. It did. He spotted the figure just before the bend in the arroyo, where the rocks curved in on themselves like folded arms. At first, it looked like nothing but a bundle of wet hides and broken wood. But the closer he rode, the more the shape became something unmistakably human and broken. The cowboy pulled his horse to a stop and stared down. A man lay twisted at the base of the slope, one leg bent the wrong way, blood seeping through a jagged gash above the knee. His chest rose and fell, barely. His face was painted, though the rain had washed much of it away, leaving streaks of ochre and ash. His braid was matted with dirt and blood. He wore the necklaces of a leader. Not a scout. Not a boy. A chief. The cowboy looked around. No one in sight. Not a rider, not a hoofprint, not even a bird on the wind. He dismounted slowly. His boots hit the mud with a soft squelch. He knelt beside the injured man and studied him, eyes tracing the injury, the pulse in his neck, the way his fingers twitched like he was still trying to grip something lost. The chief opened his eyes barely. The two men locked stares. No words passed, none needed. The cowboy reached for his canteen and brought it to the man's lips. The chief coughed, drank, then passed back into the half-conscious realm between pain and sleep. The cowboy stayed kneeling for a long moment, rainwater dripping from his hat to the ground. Then he stood. He uncinched the saddlebag, pulled out a rope, and began fashioning a rough splint from his rifle scabbard and a length of mesquite. His hands moved with certainty, not quickly, but surely. He wrapped the chief's leg, tightened it until the man groaned, then hoisted him with effort onto the horse's back. The gelding shifted, but the cowboy steadied him with a wordless touch. He adjusted the chief's weight, looped the reins through the saddle horn, and stepped back. "You'll ride," he said, his voice low and hoarse from disuse. "I'll walk." And with that, he took the first step. Mud clung to his boots. The horse moved behind him, carrying the weight of a man who, by all accounts, should have been his enemy. The sun was still low. The town was still far. And the cowboy didn't look back once. He walked into the coming heat like a man paying off a debt no one else remembered. By the time the cowboy reached the edge of town, the sun had already begun to slip behind the hills, dragging long, bruised shadows across the dirt. His boots were caked with mud, each step a quiet protest of weariness. The horse was gone, along with the chief. He'd seen to that, turning the reins over to the tribe's outriders once they met him halfway. No thanks, no promises, just a nod and a ride back alone. Now, as he stepped past the first fence post marking the town line, the air felt different. Not just heavy from the day's heat, but charged like the moment before lightning strikes. Someone spotted him from the livery and barked a name not everyone knew. The shout echoed, heads turned. He walked past the general store without pause. A mother pulled her child off the steps. At the blacksmith's, the hammering stopped. The sound of metal on metal silenced mid-swing. By the time he reached the saloon, 3 men stood waiting on the boardwalk ranch hands, 2 of them drunk, one sober and angry in the way only a brother of the dead can be. "You helped him?" one said, spitting the words like sour whiskey. "Ain't no one made you sheriff of decency, friend." The cowboy didn't stop walking. Another stepped off the planks, hand resting on the handle of his belt knife. "You think they'd do the same for you? That chief you hauled in, he's got blood on his hands. Maybe yours now too." The cowboy kept his hands loose at his sides, his face unreadable. He passed them without a word. Not defiant, just done. From across the street, the sheriff stood with one boot propped against a post, chewing a sprig of sagebrush. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He just watched the cowboy limp past with a look that held no answers, only weight. Then, behind the saloon, a thin trail of smoke rose skyward, spiraling into the twilight. Like a whisper too loud. A signal. Not one meant for townsfolk. By nightfall, they came. No drums, no screams, just the flicker of torches on the ridges, lining the canyon lip like stars brought down to earth. Riders moved like shadows circling, silent. Horses lined the far horizon in unnatural stillness. Not charging, not yet. But there. Children were pulled inside, guns dusted off. The bell atop the church rang once, low and uneven, before falling silent again. The streets emptied, doors closed, lamps turned off. Inside the saloon, whispers turned to curses. Bottles were shoved aside for bullets. The drunkest man became the loudest, demanding blood before breakfast. But no one left the building. Outside, the cowboy sat on the stoop of the old jail, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the darkened ridge. His hands rested on his knees, not near his rifle, just waiting. Someone behind him muttered, "You brought this." Maybe he had. But he wasn't going to run from it. The noose had been tied. The knot was his choice. The tightening well, that was up to dawn. The creek bed had long since gone dry, cracked and bleached by seasons of Sunday dust, stirred at the edges with every breath of wind, rising in lazy spirals like old ghosts. It was the kind of place where nothing grew anymore, not even the stubborn weeds that used to cling between the rocks. But now, two figures stood there facing each other in the hush of a brittle morning. On one side, the cowboy, coat flapping in the breeze, boots planted just over the town line. His hat shaded his eyes, but the lines on his face were etched deep with strain. He hadn't slept. He hadn't cleaned the blood from his shirt. His rifle was slung across his back, untouched. Across the riverbed stood the war captain, tall, unmoving. His horse waited behind him, reins loose. He wore bone and braid, his face streaked with ochre, though time and heat had faded the edges. Around him, a small group of riders waited, but none approached. This wasn't a battlefield yet. It was a conversation waiting to happen. Between them stood the boy. No longer a child, but not yet grown into the man he would become, maybe 15, at most. Brown-skinned, sun-dark, eyes darting between both sides like he expected thunder to split the sky at any moment. He had once mucked the cowboys' stables in exchange for meals and quiet words in English. Now, he was the only voice both men would trust. The war captain said something first short, clipped. The boy translated without embellishment. "He wants to know why you carried our elder across your land." The cowboy's jaw worked once, then stopped. He looked past the boy and met the captain's gaze full on. "Because he was dying," he said, "and I could help." The boy translated slowly. The wind caught his hair as he spoke. There was a pause. The war captain said nothing. His men didn't move. Even the horses behind him seemed to hold their breath. The cowboy stepped forward, just half a stride, enough to put his boots into the dust of the riverbed. Not a threat, not a retreat. He was heavy, the cowboy added. Could have let the storm take him. No one would have blamed me, but I didn't. He took another step, still calm. I've seen too many men left behind because it was easier to look the other way. The boy looked up, hesitated, then translated again. The captain stared, his face unreadable. He stepped down into the riverbed too, until they stood level, 10 paces apart, both boots in the dust. Still, neither touched a weapon. "You said he was dying," the boy said, voice quieter now. "Why did you give him your only horse?" The cowboy didn't blink. "Because that's what you do when someone can't walk." A silence fell, then not tense, but deep, like the earth itself was listening. The boy looked between them, swallowed, then asked in a voice barely more than a whisper, "Would you have done the same?" The question hung there naked, dangerous. Behind them, the town watched. The ridges watched. Even the sky, bruised with the first hint of storm again, seemed to wait for the answer. And just like that, everything turned on, whether silence would speak, or whether someone would reach first for steel. The sound of hooves broke through the silence like the first raindrop before a flood. Slow, measured. Not the gallop of war, but the return of something heavier. All eyes turned toward the ridge as a single rider emerged against the pale light, backlit by the rising sun, framed like judgment descending. The horse was the same chestnut gelding the cowboy had led for years. Now, it carried another. The wounded chief. Propped upright, draped in furs, not for warmth but for ceremony. His body swayed slightly with each step. Two younger riders flanked him, one guiding the reins, the other holding a tall standard of woven red thread. The chief's face was drawn, lined deeper than before, but his eyes burned clear. Clearer than any in the valley. As they approached the dried riverbed, murmurs stirred among the townsfolk behind the saloon and the warriors lining the ridge. No one reached for a weapon. Not yet, but hands hovered near grips. Hearts beat harder. Something had changed. The chief raised a single hand. The riders halted. The horse stepped forward alone now, bearing him straight to the center, where the cowboy still stood across from the war captain. Dust swirled in spirals around them, kicked up by no wind at all. The boy, the translator, stood frozen, eyes darting between them, unsure who would speak first. But it wasn't the boy who broke the silence. It was the chief. His voice was rough, like a dry leaf against stone. He spoke slowly, every syllable carved out of effort and pain. The boy translated only pieces, his voice trembling. He says, "He was left to die by enemies once. He knows the sound of men walking away." The chief gestured, weakly, toward the cowboy. But this man did not walk away. The boy choked on the next words. He says, "The horse was not a gift. It was a burden shared." Then the chief did something no one expected. He reached behind him, fingers fumbling until he pulled free the long ceremonial spear, its haft wrapped in dyed leather, feathers tied near the blade. The symbol of his authority, the lineage of his leadership, passed from elder to elder for generations. Without ceremony, without preamble, he snapped it across his knee. The crack echoed like thunder on dry earth. A gasp rippled through the gathered warriors. The air itself seemed to recoil. Even the cowboy flinched, just slightly, as splinters fell to the ground between them. The chief let the broken halves fall. The dust drank them. The boy spoke again, voice steadier now. He says this was never a rescue. It was a message. Silence followed. One of the older warriors behind the captain dropped his head. Another placed his palm flat against his chest. And then, one by one, the line of riders on the ridge began to lower their weapons, not by command, but by understanding. The war captain looked to the cowboy. Something unreadable passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or respect shaped like restraint. The cowboy didn't speak. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Because finally, it was clear. He hadn't carried an enemy across the desert. He'd carried a promise. The wind had just begun to breathe again when the whistle rose thin, shrill, and wrong. It cut through the reverent hush like a nail dragged across glass. Heads turned sharply toward the northern ridge, eyes narrowing beneath wide brims and painted brows. Even the horses stiffened, ears twitching in alarm. It was not the sound of drums or hooves, nor the call of an eagle or the cry of warning. It was man-made, industrial, a signal without soul. Then came the glint. Metal caught sunlight in quick flashes, rifle barrels, bayonets, brass buttons in clean rows. A military column crested the rise like a blade pulled from a sheath. Cavalry first, mounted and uniformed. Then infantry, boots kicking dust in unison, rifles slung in discipline. A wagon followed, topped with a field cannon, wheels creaking with polished menace. At the front of it all rode a man too clean for this place. The colonel, straight-backed, eyes narrow beneath a regulation cap, mustache trimmed to bureaucratic perfection. He surveyed the valley below like a chessboard already decided. No surprise showed on his face, only calculation. He didn't see the broken spear on the ground. He didn't hear the silence that had just become sacred. All he saw were numbers. His aide raised a spyglass, scanned the ridgelines where the warriors stood, then leaned in and said something low. The colonel nodded once, then turned to his bugler. A sharp note rang out, a formation signal. Down in the creek bed, the cowboy turned slowly, eyes climbing the slope until they landed on the column. He knew that uniform. Knew what it meant when the army showed up late, proud, and sure of its own righteousness. They'd been sent by the governor. Men who thought diplomacy wore medals and treaties came from rifle barrels. The war captain stepped forward, chest rising. His hand dropped instinctively to the blade at his hip. The cowboy stepped between them before anything could escalate, lifting one hand not high, just enough to say, "Wait." But behind him, the warriors began to move. Torches lowered, shields adjusted. The line reformed, but not for retreat. For readiness. The chief, still seated on the gelding, raised his hand weakly and pointed to the rising threat. A wheeze escaped his chest, not a word, just a breath that said everything. This was the moment the promise might break. The colonel's voice boomed across the divide. "By authority of the state, this gathering is unlawful. Disperse immediately, or force will be applied." He didn't ask questions, didn't care who was wounded or who had walked through rain to save a life. His orders were written in black ink miles away, and that was all that mattered to him. The cowboy shouted up toward the ridge. "They've laid down arms. You fire that cannon and you'll start a war you can't ride out of." But the colonel wasn't listening. His eyes were already on the cannon crew, who were setting the angle, loading powder, acting like peace was just another variable to ignore. The boy standing between the war captain and the cowboy looked up at them both. "He doesn't see," he said. "He doesn't feel it." No, he didn't. And now, with a trigger-happy line of soldiers tightening their grips and a proud line of warriors refusing to kneel, time was collapsing fast. What had taken a night to build trust, understanding. The first breath of something fragile was now seconds from being shattered by a man who thought silence meant surrender. The cowboy reached slowly for his saddlebag. He wasn't drawing a weapon. He was looking for proof. Because words had failed. And lead was waiting. The cowboy stepped forward slowly, boots grinding into the dry riverbed, each movement deliberate, visible to both sides. Dust rose with every step, catching light like ash. The air between the two forces was stretched thin, brittle. On one side, a wall of rifles disciplined, polished, waiting for the order. On the other, a line of warriors, mounted and ready, their silence louder than any war cry. Between them, only the cowboy moved. He said nothing as he approached the midpoint, the place where peace had tried to root itself just minutes ago. Where a spear had been broken, not in rage, but in hope. And now, under the eye of a colonel who saw only insurgency, that hope trembled like a wick in wind. The cowboy reached into his coat. No sudden movement, no flare of defiance. Just slow, plain intent. The pouch he pulled out was small weather-worn leather, tied with a strip of rawhide. No ornamentation, no metal. But every warrior on the ridge recognized it the moment it caught the light. The pouch bore a mark, a circle made of braided lines, cut and dyed into the leather with sacred care. The seal of the elder council. The chief's seal. He held it up in silence. A murmur rippled through the warrior line. The war captain lowered his weapon an inch. The boy translated without waiting to be asked. "It's the peace offering," he said, voice catching. The chief was riding to deliver it, himself. The colonel's jaw tightened, but his eyes squinted at the pouch. Suspicion, not comprehension. The cowboy took another step toward the soldiers, toward that line drawn not in the sand but in threat. When he reached the midpoint, he stopped, held the pouch higher, then untied it with careful fingers. From inside, he pulled a carved token bone, polished, smooth, etched with a pair of birds facing opposite directions. The symbol of dual paths. It had been cut from the rib of a bison, smoothed with ash, and anointed with river clay. A traditional marker of peace between tribes. And now, it had been given to an outsider to carry. The cowboy turned to face the colonel directly, eyes burning under the brim of his hat. "This isn't a rebellion," he said. "It's a treaty. This token was meant to be placed in your hand, not dropped in a coffin." He stepped forward and extended the pouch. The colonel hesitated. Then, slowly, he rode down from the ridge, stopping just shy of the riverbed. Dust swirled around the hooves of his horse. He looked down at the cowboy, then reached out and took the pouch. He opened it, inspected the token, ran his thumb across the etched birds. The cowboy's voice stayed low, but it carried. "You ride over that line now," he said, "and you'll break what was just rebuilt. You'll start something that no bullet can end." Behind him, the warriors did not flinch. Behind the colonel, the soldiers held their position, eyes flicking between officer and token. The colonel didn't speak. Not right away. He looked past the cowboy, toward the war captain, toward the chief, still slumped on the chestnut horse, watching with eyes gone hollow from pain. And the colonel finally saw not insurgents, not threats, but men who had waited to be heard. He turned the token over once more in his hand. And for the first time since the ridge had been lined with soldiers, he did not signal, he did not order fire. He just held that fragile piece of bone like it weighed more than the cannon behind him. Because it did. The valley exhaled. The guns stayed shouldered. The cannon crew paused mid-motion, hands frozen over the fuse. Warriors eased their grips on spears, though no one relaxed completely. Not yet. The medicine pouch had stopped the bleeding, but no one knew if the wound would heal or merely fester slower. Then, like the first drop after drought, the sound of a drum echoed across the canyon. Not a war drum, but a steady, grounded rhythm. Ceremonial, low, a heartbeat. The tribal elders stepped forward, summoned by silence more than words. They moved with slow authority, furs and feathers whispering against their movements. Behind them, younger voices fell quiet. Warriors dismounted, riders stepped away from horses. The circle began to form. At the same time, down the slope, the townsfolk began to gather outside the saloon, by the dry well, under the eaves of the chapel. Rough men with cracked hands and rifles, women holding children by the shoulders, shopkeepers, wranglers, blacksmiths, each with their reasons to be afraid, and perhaps to hope. The sheriff stood with arms crossed. The preacher took off his hat. They didn't know what kind of meeting this was, only that it had to happen. The cowboy stood between them, the token passed, the pouch empty now, still not speaking unless he had to. His role wasn't to lead, just to bear weight. The boy stepped forward, the same stable hand-turned translator who had carried truths across languages like a tightrope walker. He took the center. He looked first to the circle, then to the townspeople. "They want to speak," he said, "and you have the right to answer." No one moved. Then a voice broke from the crowd. It came from a woman standing just outside the chapel doors. She was older than most, shawl pulled tight against her shoulders, her face weathered not by sun but by waiting. She had no rifle, no badge, just a folded letter in her hand. "My husband," she said, her voice dry but unshaking, "died 5 years ago, shot through the chest riding with the 4th Battalion. Said he was bringing law to wild men. She looked up, met the gaze of the war captain across the dust. And he was wrong. The crowd shifted uneasily. She stepped forward. He never knew their names, only the distance between his rifle and theirs. But this man, she pointed at the cowboy, closed that distance. On foot. Silence again. If mercy rides faster than hate, she said, maybe we all get home. The boy translated slowly, carefully, the words stumbling but true. There was no applause, no speech, just the sound of breath being held and released. Then the boy spoke again. They will vote, as will you. Not by tribes, not by blood, but by values. The tribal circle passed a feather from hand to hand. Those who held it stood or remained seated clear in choice, quiet in dignity. The townspeople used a stone from the well. One by one, they placed it on either side of the church, steps left for peace, right for force. The piles grew uneven. Peace outnumbered. By only a little. But enough. The sheriff nodded once. The war captain lowered his blade. The colonel, standing above it all, gave a subtle wave to his men stand down. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed shape. Weapons were not dropped, they were set aside. Not forgotten. Just no longer needed. The boy looked to the cowboy. It's done, he said. And for the first time in 2 days, the cowboy let his shoulders ease. Not in victory. In relief. The morning passed slowly, like a breath held too long. No one cheered. There were no parades, no declarations. Just the quiet rearranging of things, of weapons, of opinions, of what mattered now that blood hadn't been spilled. Clouds hung high above the mesa, drifting slow and scattered, their bellies heavy with the threat of another storm. But for now, the sky was dry. The light came through softer, filtered through ash and dust, as if the sun itself was cautious about shining too brightly on something still healing. The cowboy stood near the edge of the dry riverbed, arms resting on the wooden post of the corral gate that hadn't held cattle in years. His boots were scuffed, raw. His coat, once stiff with trail-worn pride, now hung loose on him, creased at the shoulders, streaked with dried mud, one pocket torn open. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, and not just from fatigue. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats, steady and light, moving slow down the trail. He turned his head. The chestnut gelding ambled toward him, untethered, unsaddled. Its reins dragged behind like a question mark. Dust clung to its coat in patches, and one of its hooves carried a dried smear of red. But it walked soundly, head low, eyes calm. It hadn't run off, it hadn't been taken. It had been sent back. The cowboy stepped forward, boots crunching gravel, and raised a hand. The horse stopped just shy of him, close enough to feel the breath between them. The cowboy didn't speak. He just reached out and brushed a hand down the animal's neck, fingers dragging gently through the dust and sweat. Behind him, the tribal column was already thinning. The chief still sat atop a black mare, surrounded by elders and riders. He looked directly at the cowboy, pain still etched into every crease of his face, and nodded once. No smile, no wave. Just a solemn mark of recognition between men who had both carried more than they were meant to. And then the chief turned his mount. One by one, like mist caught by the rising heat, the warriors disappeared into the high trails, their silhouettes vanishing into rock and shadow. No banners, no cries, only wind and hoofbeats receding. The townspeople began to stir again. Doors creaked open. A hammer rang once from the smithy, as if someone needed to hear something solid. Children crept out, not quite understanding what they'd been spared. The sheriff lit a match and leaned against the post office wall, the flame fluttering just enough to prove life had gone on. The cowboy didn't move. He watched the last rider vanish over the ridge. Then he turned back to his horse and placed a hand on its withers. He didn't mount. He didn't lead it away. He just stood there a moment longer, quiet. In the stillness, a voice rose deep, steady, not his own, but threaded through the dust like wind through cottonwood. The road to peace costs more than a horse. Sometimes it takes your only one. The wind shifted, carrying away the last echoes of war that never came. But what would you have done?